guys, what's up? It's me, Priscilla. So for today, once again, I'm still battling somewhat of my leftover cold. So if you hear the sickness in my voice, I apologize. So for today, I thought it'd be a really fun, tips and tricks tutorial about watercolor. There are different kinds of types of watercolor techniques that you can do in order to apply to your watercolor masterpieces when it comes to textures. So I don't know if many of you have had like basic high school art class. Every single art class, my art teacher would sit us down and she'd have us make all of these little thumbnails and go through each one with our watercolor just to experiment. So in case you've never had to sit down and make those fun little thumbnails, like I'm starting one right now to teach you guys, I'm going to teach you different types of textures that you can apply to your watercolor masterpieces. Some of you might have noticed me using these kind of texture techniques when it comes to watercolor in some of my time lapses or something like that. But in case you've never known, I'm going to teach you those today. You saw me apply this whole layer, this first layer of watercolor. So what I want to do is, this technique is called wet on wet, and it's basically, it gives you a really awesome texture and everything. It's what I use on most of my backgrounds of my characters when I'm doing my galaxy technique. I use the technique wet on wet a lot. So what I would do while the paint is still wet, as you can see, that's when I would take a whole other little bit of that watercolor I just used. So I'm using my blue, and that's when I would go like this. And I'm just gonna leave it like that just so you guys can see how it dries out. While I'm waiting for this to dry, I'm gonna jump down to the next one. Now this is another fun technique that, as you can see, I completely filled in this entire box with purple watercolor. Now, while it's still wet, I would go ahead and take from my little paint jar with my paintbrush and apply droplets, just plain water. And you can see how it's making that texture. Almost kind of reminds you of maybe I don't know, when I look at it, I think of snow. And you see how it's separating and everything, and we're gonna let that dry, and then we're gonna jump down to the next block and I'll talk to you about this next technique. Now for this technique, it's a little fun because it involves your very own table kitchen salt. As you can see, I just dropped a few pieces and you can see it already. This is a great substitution for snow or bubbles. As I'm just sprinkling it on, you can see that salt has some chemical reaction to where it separates the color of the watercolor. I don't know what's going on exactly science-wise, but it's just so cool. As I just sprinkle it on, I've seen many watercolor artists use this technique. Another one of my favorite texture techniques when it comes to watercolor is using tissue paper. Now this is no special tissue paper, it's just basically, a Kleenex. This is actually toilet paper, and there you can see the really cool texture it gives off. As we're waiting for those other paintings to dry, while we're waiting to dry, I'm gonna keep going. This is called masking fluid, and the particular brand that I have is by Winsor & Newton. Now, you have probably heard me say this thing so many times, but this is a remarkable thing to use if you don't want to get something in watercolor. So if I just dip in my brush, these things will kill your brushes. There is a special brush for masking fluid to apply with, but I found that it really doesn't work. So you will ruin your brushes with this. So if I just go like this, now you really can't see what I'm doing right now just because it is a white masking fluid, and you can buy a tinted yellow masking fluid so you can actually see where you're putting your masking fluid on. But at the time when I went to Michael's to pick up this masking fluid, they were out of the tinted stuff and I really needed some, so I only bought the white stuff. And I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna let my masking fluid dry, and then that's when I would go ahead and go over that entire spot with watercolor. And make sure you rinse off your brush that you use for the masking fluid as fast as possible, because if you let that stuff dry, your brush is completely ruined. So just keep that in mind if you ever give masking fluid a go with your watercolor. So another really fun technique that you guys can try out is by using rubbing alcohol. So this is basic rubbing alcohol. So if I take my rubbing alcohol, magical. And now this would be a really fun technique for like bubbles in underwater. Of course, there is the famous technique of dry brush, which is basically you would go over to your paint and it's like getting as least possible water as you can onto your brush from the watercolor. Alright, let's jump up back to masking fluid, and that's when I would go over my masking fluid. As you can see, nothing's touching that. I would let that dry and then I would peel it off, which we will do in a second. Another really awesome technique that I recently became really fond of was a technique of using watercolor first and then filling it in with ink. So if I were to make little tulip bulbs. Now I would let these go ahead and dry before, of course, I go and take a pen and I line around them and just give them a little bit more definition. So we're just gonna let these dry for a bit. This one right here, as you've all been probably wondering, why is this filled in with purple and she's not doing anything to it? This is what we're going to use for our splatter technique. So I've got a wide brush right here, and all I do, of course, it's one of the easiest tricks everywhere. That's another technique for splattering in case you want to make like a galaxy painting and you want to make stars. That's an easy substitute. Sometimes splattering makes like lines, so that's why I never use it on my galaxy paintings and I make the individual stars themselves, because splattered little lines aren't exactly stars. They might be a lot of shooting stars, but still. Another fun technique is called a graded wash, and it's basically like making an ombre. So I've got a green and I grab a lot of it and I start off at the top with my straight color of green. I'm gonna go back into my water, and that's when I'm gonna bring it down. And as you can see, it's gonna fade downwards. So it's very similar to an ombre. I'm just gonna bring it down, but only add water. Now, of course, you could use this technique with different colors to maybe mix it up just a bit. And these two colors will bleed in beautifully together. It's just like another technique of wet on wet, but this time instead of using just like water in the same color, you're using a different color. Let's jump back up to my masking fluid, where I would go and I would peel off the masking fluid. There is no special technique to peel off the masking fluid, you just gotta pick at it. That's masking fluid. Now, since my tulips are dry, this is when I would go in with my ink. No special ink in particular. This one's just a Statler pen and I just like using it. Now you could do this the reverse way, where you would draw in lines and then fill it in with watercolor. But sometimes, I don't know, I really like seeing like it looks almost childish in a way. I actually used this technique on the house from Up, Disney's Pixar Up, and I filled in the balloons this way, where I filled in all the balloons like I did the bulbs, and then I went in with my pen and I filled in the balloons, and it looked really, really cool. So this would be a fun, like, get well. Check out the dry brush area. See, I would go over it with like I'm going over it with a black. And it's just basically as least amount of water as possible. And of course, another technique would to be use wax. So I have a yellow crayon here. And as you can see up here where I left this whole red block, I went ahead and I applied one layer. Now this of course is that trick on layers, what I've always taught you guys in any of my other videos. So as you can see, there are tons of different ways to apply texture to your paintings. For example, here is a picture of Peter Pan. As you can see, I used the wet on wet technique, and when it was still wet, I went in with white gouache and dropped white gouache around. And see, when this part was all still wet, I dropped the yellow around it. And I actually used masking fluid. You can still see a couple of pieces still stuck to it. Masking fluid to fill in Tinkerbell and Peter Pan so they would not get any watercolor on them, because I wanted to do the background and then I wanted to fill them in. Obviously this is a work in progress, but as you can see, this is these techniques are what I like to use for my backgrounds. If you don't want to get too detailed with them, but you still want them to look really amazing and you want your main focus to be on the characters of the picture, then any of these texture techniques with watercolor would be perfect for you guys to use. But yes guys, I hope this helps. I hope you give it a try on your next watercolor piece. I'm sorry if this is a bit repetitive to some of you who have had art class. I know a lot of people don't have the opportunity to take art classes like we do, so I thought it would be fun to teach these watercolor techniques in case anyone needs them. But yes guys, I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you all later. Bye!